going back to the future. Who here loves CSS? Yes. Does anybody hate CSS? Look, I hear you, but by the end of this talk, we're all going to be united as CSS lovers. I hope so. Because CSS and HTML are getting much more powerful, and probably a lot more powerful than you realize if you haven't been keeping up with the changes in the UI space. And so, a little note about this talk. I am talking about APIs that are new. I'm showing this whole presentation in Chrome Canary, so these are live demos you'll see. But because some of these APIs are not shipped in all browsers yet, if you are thinking about using them, think about your current browser support. So I'm not going to get into browser support, but know that all of these APIs are standards track APIs, which means that they've gone through the standards development process. We heard a little bit about how the JavaScript ECMAScript process works yesterday. All of these, with the exception of one feature, should at least not have any opposition and land cross-browser in the near future. So keep that in mind. This is a little look into the future. The future looks like this. Has anyone here had to build a dropdown? Yeah? Was it fun? It was not fun. Building something like this used to be really annoying. You'd have to recreate this entire thing out of divs. You'd have to add all your aria, all your states, all your events. But now you can do this with HTML. It's built right into the browser. It's pretty cool. Or something like this, where you might have multiple popovers that are anchored to their elements. And you might want one on a button and a link. And now you can do this, again, with just some attributes. Or something like this. This is all done without any JavaScript. And what I'm doing here is I'm using a data attribute in a way that I'm now able to type it. We have typing. You can pull the data attribute into a calc function and use that to get something like a % of fill, right? So then I can use that data attribute, multiply it by 20% because I'm trying to fill this star. These stars are a mask of 5 stars, so times 20% will be the percentage out of 100% on that star mask to fill it. And then I could set the background here to a linear gradient that has a start and stop point after that first break at that % fill. And then I can just use the mask image. I can also use the data rating as content. So now attributes used to only be strings that you could use like this, but we can pull them into calc functions and type them, give them percentages, numbers, actual semantic meaning. The most exciting things happening in web development right now are happening in CSS and HTML. And I stand by that. And so that's why I think that this is the best way to really level up as a developer, especially in the JavaScript space, when you're probably not following along with what's happening in the UI world. But this is how to make your job easier, just knowing what's possible with modern UI capabilities and knowing that these things exist. So why care about CSS and UI at a web developer conference, right, that focuses on JavaScript? I think the biggest reason is separating your logic and style. We used to have to hack this, or we'd have to write styles in JavaScript because there wasn't a better way to do it. It lets you reduce third-party dependencies if you could just do something which is less code to maintain and less complexity of your applications. This makes it easier to build accessible interfaces as well, when you can let the browser handle a lot of that logic for you and all those events and stateful hooks and all the aria that would be built in. And this means that you also get better performance because you're not adding all these scripts to make styles happen on the page. They're just built in on the browser engine level. And that means that you can also build faster and make your life easier, and we can all go to the sauna and relax. This presentation is using a couple of these new features. So one example is scroll state queries. Who here has heard of scroll state queries? I see one hand, I see 2 hands. Okay, so I'm going to take it, the rest of you don't. That's okay, there's a lot of cool new stuff, and this is a new feature. So if you ever used a container query, you set a container type. This container type is scroll state, and then you can use that. I'm also using nesting syntax, which is shipped cross-browser in CSS. So for the presentation, if you're wondering, why do I have an @media query nested inside of this open bracket for slide like this. That's because it's nested CSS. So then I can use this container query, which is scroll state, and I'm going to say on the snapped state, when I'm snapped in the X position, then any list item that has this class of animate forward gets this animation fade in. And it's going to fade in over half a second, right? Then I can also set an animation delay and use another new feature in CSS, which is called sibling index. So now we have sibling index and sibling count. Sibling count tells you how many children exist within that subtree that you're targeting, or sibling index would be the index of the child that you're targeting. So in this case, I'm multiplying each one by 0.5 seconds. And to make it kind of work faster, I'll just set it to 0.5, so you can see when I go back to the slide, that we're snapped on the X position, everything is trilling in at 0.5 seconds, which I think is pretty cool. What's even cooler is there, like I mentioned, is no JavaScript here. So this is actually a color font. And if you inspect it, and I look at the style, this is just I think a cool feature. There's no span tags. There's no added stuff here. I can update the styles here, 0.15 seconds, and it auto updates in the slide itself. Because it's just CSS, and this is CSS with a content editable tag on it. It's a style block. Just a lot of cool stuff in there. Built-in syntax highlighting is here, my friends. You don't need any heavy libraries, no added span tags. It supports text area, dynamic text editing. To learn more, check out Glyph Drawing Club. It's called Font with a Syntax Highlighter. I think it's fun. So let's go on an adventure. This is where it gets really fun. I am going to walk you through 3 more complex UI experiences, UI problems to solve. The first is this customizable select with these scrollable credit cards on a radial plane. The next is that demo I showed you where you have these multiple popovers. And then the last one is this carousel that has a lot of fun things going on. It has this little anchored pointer at the bottom. It has these little markers. It has some animation happening. You can do all of these things with 0 JavaScript. Ooh. Okay. Let's start with customizable select. So the recipe for this one is the new customizable select element, scroll-driven animation, CSS trigonometric function, so we now have math in CSS and quite a lot of it, registered custom properties, and carousel markers to give it a little bit of a bonus. So has anyone here actually played with the new customizable select yet? Okay, I see 2 hands. Has anyone here heard of it? Did you know that you can do this now? A couple more of you, but be prepared to be amazed. So customizable select, this solves a lot of problems. The way to enter into this new customizable select mode is to set appearance-based select on your select element and a new element called picker select. This is a functional pseudo element. Picker select is the dropdown. This is how you opt in, and once you opt in, you have access to a whole bunch of new controls. The select is the button, the in-page button that you can style, and you can do that today, however you want. So that's the parent for that section. You also have a picker icon pseudo, so you can style that drop-down arrow, and selected content, and this is really interesting. So this is a new HTML element that actually mirrors the content inside of your options. Then I mentioned that you have the picker. This is the entire picker select here. You have your options. The options now have a checkmark pseudo that you also have access to fully customizing and styling. And of course, you have states, so the checked class state. So that means that you can build something like this just using CSS and HTML. And if we look at it, we just have a select. I give a name, an ID, and then that's all basic stuff. Here's where it gets interesting. You have the button, and then you have the selected content, and that's what we're reflecting from our options. Then our options just look like regular HTML, where you can have values on them. You can have icons now. You could have meta text. You could go crazy. As long as it's not an interactive element, it is accessible. So, well, you have to have your correct alt images. Just no interactive elements are allowed in custom selects because that breaks the model and becomes a combo box. So one cool thing here is if you noticed, when I click on this, the options have this additional subtitle, right? That text is not being reflected when I click it. And that's because as an HTML element, you now have CSS access to it. So you could say selected content subtitle and selected content icon display none. So I can still show the little badge, but I just have the shorthand visible when you've selected it to save space. And I see these types of selects all over the platform. So that's essentially what this is. This is a select where I can click it. That's the active state. That's essentially like a check mark. And I'm just navigating it in a different way, in a little radial plane. So let's talk about that. How do we do that? So the way that we can think about this radial plane is in these polar coordinates or radial coordinates. And you can do things like this, where you can have icons that kind of move on this radial plane. If you remember trigonometry in math, this is basically just cosine and sine multiplied by the radius, which is going to be the size of that button, plus some gap or some distance that you want. So in CSS, that looks like this. We have our transform function, and we're going to translate it on those x and y coordinates. And so the x coordinate is the cosine of the angle times the radius, and the radius is going to be the button size plus that gap. And then the y position is going to be the sine of the angle times the radius. And then we can give it a transition, we can delay it using sibling index, we could do all that stuff. But to do this before, I would have to do this, where I'd give each one of those buttons in that menu a background, an angle, a delay. Now you can use sibling index to make this faster. Sibling index is one index, not zero index. So to have it zero indexed, you just subtract one. And then we can dynamically set the angle by multiplying it by negative 45 degrees. So every single item is going to be multiplied by negative 45 degrees to get the angle. The delay is going to be the sibling index minus 1 times 0.1 seconds, because the first item I don't want to have a delay. And then I would just apply the angle and the radius on the transform. So we can really start to improve our CSS and make it a lot more dynamic and a lot more functional. And now, speaking of functions, we have functions that just landed in CSS. Who here has heard about this? Who knew about this? Yeah? All right, a couple of you. Functions are awesome. In CSS, they're basically like fancy custom properties. So what you can do to set a function is you set up something like radial coordinate, you give it a name, and then it takes values. So in this function, it's accepting an A value for angle and a rad value for the radius. And then the result is the block here that you would return. So I'm returning this translate property, and in that I'm returning an x and y, doing the calculations inside the function. So now you don't even have to see that messy CSS inside of your styles. You can just call the function, and you can call it by saying transform radial chord, calling the function name, and then my variables of angle and delay. They could be the same name, I just wanted to differentiate here. So this is a lot cleaner. You can see that it says radial coordinate. Now I know where I'm transforming when I am writing this code. And then we could take it a step further with sibling index, and if I wanted to just dynamically generate the colors, I could do that too. So I don't even have to go and give every single item its own color. I could just have this using HSL, where I'm setting the hue times 40, so that's the value of the hue, but I want it to be sort of pastel and light, so the saturation and lightness is going to be a high percentage. So this can all be done with just this little bit of CSS, and I feel like it's pretty clean. Like, this is the future. This is modern CSS. Exciting. What about scroll-driven animations? Okay, I see a couple of nods. Scroll-driven animations are awesome. They let you create animations on a scroller timeline instead of on a time-based timeline. So in this case, we're using the viewport, and the animation timeline is the view. And what we're doing is we have this keyframe of appear that's going from opacity 0 to 1, and it's translating up. This kind of is a popular effect to make things sort of pop into a page like this. What we're now doing is setting the animation range, so we set it to entry from 0 to 25%. So at the 25% mark of this scroll, right there, it finishes the animation, and it's tied to the scroller. And this requires no JavaScript, so it's way more performant than many solutions I've seen out there. And it's a great progressive enhancement, too. If you're doing small things like that to add a little bit of pizzazz, a little bit of a nice sort of user journey as they're going through your page, this, if it's not supported across browser yet, which it's now landing across browsers, is a nice progressive enhancement. So another example is this one. This one just uses the root scroller. It creates this little back to top button, so you can just click that and it goes back to top. It's just an anchor link inside your page. I thought this was fun. Different way to create an animation timeline using this root scroller. Just another little fade-in effect. But this one's going downward, so it starts at 20%. and at 20% of the scroll to 30% of the scroll, which you can see in the animation range, then it's applying the styles. So just a little fun little thing. So this here is using a mix of the trigonometric functions, positioning on the radial plane, and it's also using scroll-driven animations. And I'm also using app_property to set a value for the radius and angle here with initial values. Like CSS has typing, it has fallbacks, it has a lot of cool stuff that I think people don't realize is pretty powerful. So the last thing that I mentioned was these carousel scroll markers, and that's just like this little thing up here where it indicates where I am in the scroller. And we'll talk more about carousel scroll markers in the third demo, but they're another fun little addition to CSS. So the next demo is layered UI. Has anyone built a hover card? Hover cards are hard, man. Yeah, they're really hard, especially when you think about accessibility and how does it work across multimodal devices? How does it work? Hover makes sense, but then there's also touch. Like, what do people do for touch? What do people do for keyboard? You have to have keyboard focus too. So the recipe for this is anchor positioning. We're going to talk about some repositioning logic. We're going to talk about a new popover type, which is popover equals hint, and we're going to talk about interest invokers. So let's start with popovers, which have landed cross-browser. This feature is baseline now. Popovers are great. They enable you to create these sort of layered UI experiences where you might have something that you want to pop over the page. This could be similar to a dialogue, but I'd probably use a dialogue if you're blocking the page. Popovers don't invert the rest of the page. So they're usually used for things like tooltips or, like I mentioned, the hover cards or other information-based things that might be more ephemeral and don't block interaction with the rest of the page. Popovers can be invoked declaratively, so you can use popover target and connect the popover target to the ID of the popover, giving that element, which is a popover, the popover attribute. So all you have to do to have something be invoked declaratively in HTML, appear in the top layer, get light dismiss automatically, be keyboard accessible where you can tab into it and hit the space bar or the enter key to open it, and have the tab focus enter into the popover regardless of where it is in the DOM, is do these few things: the popover attribute, an ID on the popover, and then popover target to connect it. So you don't need React portals at all, really, to do something like this. You can do it with a couple of lines of code in HTML. It's a pretty powerful feature. So building on that, we can now connect that to anchor positioning. And in fact, popovers now have something called implicit anchoring, which means that there is an implicit anchor relationship created between the popover and its invoking element. The invoking element here is the button. So we don't even have to give it an anchor name. It already is connected. We just give it a position. And what I'm doing here is position area top, and then I'm using position try to flip it when there's no more space on top. So if I'm scrolling, yeah. The magic of CSS. So if I'm scrolling and there's no room for it to appear on the top, it'll appear on the bottom. It'll preserve that state, but if it's going to go off screen, it'll flip it. This is done in one line of CSS. Pretty cool. You can set your own positions. I'm not even going to get into that, but you can set your own position values like keyframes with the position try, and then you can name it and customize it, or you can use the browser defaults, which is flip block, flip inline, flip block. I built this tool called anchortool.com to help you position things, because there is a difference with how you position things using the position area syntax. So top center, this has a inset modified containing block, so you can kind of see the difference here between just top and then top center. It takes that cell. This is a 9-cell grid. It's a 3x3 grid that it positions on, and you can position it in a cell, or you can have it span. So here I'm left center positioned, but you can also position it left span top. So it starts at the left and it spans to that top cell, or something like this, which is right span top, or maybe you just want it in the bottom left quadrant. You can do that. You can also use logical properties here, so block end inline start, again, instead of the top center, block start center. So a lot of options here for positioning, or you can just use absolute positioning like top left, bottom right with insets. So another cool new thing that is not shipped yet, but landing soon, is a container query for anchored position. And this is the anchored container query. So to use it, you set container type anchored, And then when you have something like this, where I might have like a little arrow on the bottom of this tooltip, I can restyle that tooltip as it flips. If before this was possible, you wouldn't be able to know that you've moved into a different anchor positioning using CSS, and you wouldn't be able to restyle it, so you couldn't reposition that arrow. But now, what I can do is I could say @container anchored, and then I call the fallback. In this case, it's a user agent provided fallback, which is flip block. And when it is in the flip block position, when that before pseudo in that tooltip is in the flip block position, I'm going to restyle what is that little arrow. I'm going to move it from the top 100% to the bottom 100%, so it's going from top to bottom. And then I'm adjusting the border, because CSS triangles, we just hack them with borders. We don't have a better solution right now. So just, border bottom color, it's fine. I think we should fix this, but it is what it is. So back to the popovers, we have this invoker, which is the button. We have this tooltip, which is the popover. And we can even do more. Let's do more. Do you want to do more? Yeah. So now we can change popover target to interest for, and this changes it from a command type invoker into an interest invoker. So now when I hover or I keyboard into it, there's a delay of 0.5 seconds as the default style so that you don't accidentally hover over things and open the interest invoker by default, but it will open that popover. It invokes it. So just that gives you all of that capability, all of that statefulness, all of those interactions. The interest invokers are really, really interesting, but this one is spicy. So interest invokers, there's been a lot of work that's been done around this over the last 3.5 years, but there is currently an objection from Apple to ship it. Chrome is shipping this in 143, so there's a polyfill, and I'll talk about that in a second. This is the spiciest one of all the features. The rest are pretty standard. So here's an example of interest invokers with a hover card. You might have some text like Wikipedia does, and you might want to have an interest invoked popover. You could have actions in there. Another cool thing about interest invokers is, unlike popovers, which only work on buttons, interest invokers also work on links. So they can serve a dual action, where you could click through, like on Wikipedia, to a link, or you could have a preview of that page. And we see this all over social media sites like Blue Sky and Twitter. We see this on GitHub. We see this like all over the web. This is very common. In layered UI like this is on 94% of websites. It's a lot. So what you would do here is just set an ID. Again, you could use a double dash syntax if you want. You don't have to, but you could set the ID. And what I'm doing here is also I'm using a popover equals hint, which is a new type of popover that we're going to get into. Before we do, there is a pro tip. As I mentioned, the default user agent styles are 0.5 seconds for the delay. I like to shorten it a little bit, so like 0.3 or 0.2 seconds. But a cool thing I saw from Emil Kowalski, who has a great course in animations, is this pro tip, where if you have the delay on each item, which is the default, it feels kind of slow, right? Like you have to wait for that to open. And you don't want to accidentally hover over it and it opens, so you want some amount of delay. But you can do something where you only have an initial delay when you enter that action bar, in this case, and then you have no delay. So you have an initial delay, but then when you go to the next item, it's not slow like this. And the way to do that in one line of code is this. So you would set on the parent, you use has. The has selector is awesome. I hope that you've heard of that. Have you heard of has? Yeah? Yes. Has is game-changing. You can do so much with it. So we check if the parent has an interest source, and this is how you apply styling if something has interest. And then if it does, on those interest invokers, on the buttons, you would set the interest delay start to 0 seconds. So we might have a default 0.3, and then if the parent has interest, it's set to 0 seconds. I love CSS. This is so readable in my opinion. If the parent has interest source, style the buttons by giving it a delay of 0 seconds. I love that. Anyway, who here likes CSS a little bit now that didn't like it before? A couple hands. I'll get you all. So popover hint, the primary difference between the other types of popover and popover hint is that it doesn't close other auto popovers. Why is that important? It's important for an example like this. This is, say you have a YouTube menu where you have notifications, and you might also want to have tooltips. So when I click this bell icon, the notifications little thing is a popover. That's a popover that you might want to interact with. It's an auto popover that I can still get the light dismiss from. But I might also want to have a popover that shows the tooltip of what this is. You should always have some kind of text helper if you have icon buttons. This is not even an accessibility thing. This is like a usability for everybody thing. Like, I don't know what all of those things mean. What is this? Search with voice, why would I know that? So having some kind of indicator is very, very useful. And I think tooltips are a great way to do that, or inline text. Because I'm using popover equals hint, this notifications popover doesn't close. So that's why this works really well together and why it's important to have these different types of popovers. If it was just a regular auto popover, when I hovered over notifications, the big one would close, and we don't want that. So that's just a little detail. And that's how you create things like this, where you might have a menu, and you might have a link with comments, and then you might have, you know, a little hover popover. And it's a lot easier to build these now than it used to be. Thank goodness. So I mentioned a polyfill. The polyfill, you can just import. One note about the polyfill is the feature itself has support for keyboard. So when you hover interest, when you tab into something, when you hover with your mouse, and then on mobile devices on a long press, you'll have an item appear in the context menu. The polyfill does not have that because there's no way to access the context menu of the browser just at all. So what you can do is, with the popover, you can import it, but you only have access to the keyboard and the mouse events. And you also need to have a custom property. So you use custom property for the interest delay start or end, or the interest delay shorthand, and then it works the same. It's just like an import, and it works as long as you're using the custom properties. So I think that this is the easiest way today, still, despite browser support not being full, to do something like this, where you have these hover cards or these interest invoked elements. It's just really hard to build that. All right, now let's talk about carousels. Carousels. Has anyone built a carousel? You all need therapy. We'll go together. All right, there's a lot of cool stuff for carousels now. There's scroll snapping that is part of this recipe, and that exists today. It's very well supported. Scroll buttons are new. There's also scroll markers, scroll state queries, and anchor positioning. We're going to use anchor positioning a lot with modern CSS. It's just so useful. But CSS carousels are just fancy scrollers. So we might have this unordered list with list items. It's just regular DOM content, right? And then we can apply some styles to the carousel. We give it an overflow, X, auto, and then scroll snap type X mandatory, which means it must snap to the next item if you start to do like a little flick. And then scroll behavior smooth. Like scroll behavior smooth, a little smooth scroll never hurt anybody, you know? And it's really nice for carousels. So now we have buttons in carousels too. So if a little woo, there's a button there. So we got carousel. Scroll buttons are a new functional pseudo element that accepts 3 values. Well, you can also do not just right and left, but the logical properties too, where you can have the carousel : scroll button, and then you can style it with the star selector, which selects both right and left, or the inline start, inline end. And then you also have access to them individually. So what you can do is position it, like anchor it to the carousel. You can give it a font family. You can style the colors. You can style the borders. You can style whatever you want. And then in your actual carousel buttons on the right or the left, I don't remember which one is which. Okay, I use the L. You can just give it some content. And so in this case, because I'm using material symbols, the arrow forward looks like this. And you also want to give it an accessible label. So you can do that in the content with a slash syntax, where you would have arrow forward. This is what's going to be drawn on the screen. But then the accessible label would be scroll right. And then on the opposite side, scroll left, and then we can position these things inline end, inline start, center, and that's how you get something like this. So you have buttons now, and you also have markers. And markers are these little auto-generated dots at the bottom top side of your carousel. You could have a vertical carousel. You could have something like that where you have the markers on the side. The world is your oyster. That's the whole point. And you set this up with a scroll marker group. So now you have two new pseudo elements. You have the scroll marker group, which is the container for your scroll markers. And again, we're going to anchor position that. We can do display grid. We can give it a gap. We can do whatever we want there. And then the actual scroll markers themselves. And in the example I'm going to show you, I actually have content in them, which is the day number. And I'm using counters because why not? Aspect ratio, make them circles, some more styles. And then a really cool pseudo class is target current. So for the currently targeted scroll marker, we're going to give it some style. So in this case, there's a little white fill. That's a little white fill. You can't even see it if you're like 3 seats back, but it'll be more obvious for our demo. So to learn more about actually configuring your carousels, you can go to chrome.dev/carousel configurator, which will give you the code. You could take photos of the slides if you want, but this tool will be the tool that will help you learn how to do it. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do. You can auto-paginate. So that's cool. You can like resize and then have it auto-paginate. And just, this is the smooth scroll with the behavior X mandatory for scroll snap type. You can inert, not an auto page, but you can inert content that's not active, which is helpful. And then there's force stopping. Like another cool thing about carousels is it automatically will disable the buttons when you can't scroll past that point. And these are all things you'd have to do in JavaScript yourself. You don't have to do anymore. Okay. Anyway, life is getting better, my friends, I promise. So we've got the buttons, we've got the disabled state, we've got the scroll markers, and they're doing that little transform up when I'm selecting them, and then they're moving into place, and there's other animations going on here, so there's a lot going on. So you might have noticed or recognized scroll state queries again. We're using scroll state snapped for a bunch of these demos. So here I have the container on the list items. And then when the div inside of them is scrolled into place, I'm going to scale it up from 0.8 to 1. And that's a pretty simple little scroll state query. So what we're doing here is we have this meta text that just contains like the name of the place and a little snippet of my dream trip to France. You know, when I get bored and make demos, I can dream a little bit, right? So what we're going to do is transform this where initially the Y is going to be 100% down, and then we want to move it up a little bit, 3 rems right here, so you could see just the name. It's also 3LH, just like the line height. And then when it's snapped into place, just translate it to 0. So it kind of just pops up, nice little pop-up, little boop, little boop, boop, boop. I'm a weirdo, I'm sorry, I popped out of a cake. So lastly, there's like a really fun little demo here with target current and the scroll marker, and we're using anchoring here. There's a little indicator that follows the active item. And so what I did here is I made a little indicator div, gave it a class of indicator. I positioned it to the active target. This is an explicit anchor. I have to explicitly say it because it's not an invoker popover relationship where I want to anchor it to. I'm positioning it inset. I gave it a little bit of a margin top and a transition. But the interesting thing is I am re-anchoring it to the current target. So when the scroll marker changes and I have a new target current, this active target gets updated for where it is being positioned. So my indicator is always going to follow the active target because it's following the anchor. I like to call this like a little follow the leader technique. I wrote a blog post about it on my blog, which is here. You can find it on una.im, or you can find me on Twitter at una or una.im on Blue Sky. Anyway, there's like some blog posts and stuff that you might think are cool if you think this stuff is cool, right? I think it's cool. So this is an example of that technique also, kind of broken down, where I have a hover effect. And so I have my anchor. I am position anchoring this follower, which is this little blurb. It's not quite glass morphism, but it's just a little magnifying glass, and I'm using a little SVG filter for it. So I'm giving it a position anchor of hovered, and then on hover, I'm updating the possible anchor. Any of these could be possible anchors. So it's giving a little bit of a roving focus effect. The thing with this, though, is it's ephemeral. Hover is ephemeral. When I hover off, it's going to go back to the previous anchored state, where with the target current, this is not ephemeral. This is the currently active target, so you don't really need anything else. But here we're going to add a little bit of JavaScript to update the active element in the action bar, which you probably want to perform an action at this point anyway. And that way, it'll always go back to a new position. So bringing all this together, we have multi-anchors. We have dynamic retargeting for this bubble. And this one I actually added a little tooltip, because I said never have a button that's just an icon without some kind of information about it. It also is going to reposition here to the bottom when you might have the action bar at the top of your screen. You want to make your UI as bulletproof as possible and as flexible as possible, so this allows for that. We're using position area, position try fallbacks, popover hint, because we might not want to close other popovers on the page, and interest invokers, and then a touch of JavaScript to preserve that active state, because we're re-anchoring with something as ephemeral as hover. You can bring your own scroll markers too with scroll target group auto. Now this is a really cool feature that shipped recently, a little bit after the initial carousel APIs shipped. What you can do is set up your own anchor links, and that means that you can do stuff like this, where you can create like a scroll spy without any JavaScript. And these are all anchor links that link to different sections. So you would have in your UI, like your divs or your H1s. I have a blog where I have H1s that have IDs on them, so you could like anchor a link into them, which is also useful for just linkability too. And then I have this side list, which is like my table of contents, and that is going to be full of list items that are going to link through, right? So that makes sense. But now on that list, that table of contents, the parent, we can set scroll target group auto, and that will essentially link it to the items here. So these act as scroll markers. It is a scroll spy, but it's a marker to that part of the page. And then we can just apply styles using target current, like we did with the scroll markers. So I'm making them pink. I have this little anchoring little thing. I just love that effect right now. It's just fun. So I wrote a blog post about this at unit.im. I have the little thingy. It bounces. How cute, right? CSS can be fun. Anyway, there's a lot of new CSS stuff. There's also if, which you can use in functions. There's shape. There's range container queries that are coming. So you could say that a custom property value is in a range between two numbers. And view transitions, which I didn't even get to do or get into, but you could do stuff like this, like morphing animations without any JavaScript. And here I just have two states. I have the feedback form, which is a button. I have this open state. I have the form, and then I have the button. They're going to be swapping. They're going to be swapping views, and you can animate from display none. I'm just going to set the view transition name to be the same for the feedback form and the feedback button to transition them. And then I'm going to also capture the parent as a separate layer, so it animates too as it goes in and out. And this is just like one of many things that you can do with view transitions. There's so much. You can also now animate height 0 to auto. There's like, CSS is rad. Okay, who still hates CSS? We'll talk. This entire slide framework is built with 0 JavaScript. Like I mentioned, I showed you how I built a lot of it. It uses all this stuff. So style, content editable, font family, font with a syntax highlighter, which might be like my favorite thing. Scroll button. There's scroll markers and target current. There's scroll behavior smooth. There's at container scroll state, snapped X. There's sibling index I'm using all throughout this. So that's a lot of CSS, right? That's a lot. Is that you right now? I feel like that's me. I'm so excited about all of this stuff, but I know that it might feel a little overwhelming. So the whole point is this. Like, do you need to know everything? Do you have to know how to use everything today? And to that I say, not really. But you should be aware that it exists. If you don't know that it exists, then you can't use it and you can't benefit from it. So you might be building a feature in a couple of weeks from now, months from now. You might be building a drop-down menu a year from now. And if you just remember that little thing like, oh, I think that browsers have that natively now, it can save you a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of grief and a lot of counseling. So reach for native first. These are universal APIs. They work with whatever framework you're using. There's no dependencies. You don't have to install a third-party library and learn how to use that third-party library. And that's why I think the best way to level up your skill set as a web developer is to get good at CSS and HTML. And I love giving this talk at JavaScript events because I feel like it could really benefit you if you're not already deep in this space. This is where we're trying to make your life easier, throw in a little bit of sparkle and sprinkles in there, but also very practical things, very practical UI. So leverage the power of the browser. You can write once and it works everywhere. And raise your expectations for the web platform. The web platform is really powerful and really capable, and there's a lot that it can do. If you want to learn more and follow along, you can follow me on Twitter, Blue Sky. I have RSS, bring back RSS on my site. Yeah. You can also follow Chrome DevRel, so we're on developer.chrome.com or web.dev, where we talk about new versus stable features. If you have any thoughts on things you need in the platform or things that you're struggling with, I'm super happy to chat. I'm happy to chat about anything CSS, UI, JavaScript when it comes to UI stuff in the browser. This is like, I love this stuff, I work on this stuff, I care about this stuff, I want it to be good. So thank you so much for having me, and I hope you have an awesome day today.